We can use the display property to change the visibility or positioning of an element relative to another. On this HTML page, we've set up 4 style definitions, one for each div that we have in our HTML body: container, div1, div2, and div3, and we can see the corresponding IDs here. The first definition is for the container div. It specifies that the div will have a width and height of 400 pixels and a 1 pixel black border. Inside the container, we have 3 additional divs, div 1, 2, and 3. Each one of these nested divs has a width and height property set to 50 pixels and also a background color. And each of the divs have a different background color so we can distinguish between them. If we take a look at this file in our web browser, we can see that by default, each nested div falls one below the other. But what if we wanted each div to be displayed next to the other in a line? To do that, we can add the display property to each div. We'll set the value of this property to inline block. Now if we refresh the page, you can see that each div is now beside the other. We can also set the display property to none if we want to make an element invisible. So for example, if we did not want div3 to be visible, just change display to none. And I'll save the file and refresh, and you can see that we can no longer see that element. We can position our HTML elements in different ways, using the position property in our style sheet. Positioning is a very important concept because it will be used extensively when developing CSS-based web page layouts. There are 4 main types of position declarations that we will explore: static, relative, absolute, and fixed. The first and most basic position declaration is the static position. Static is actually the default position of an element if no position is specified. We've already worked with this many times. On this HTML page, we have a div that references ID selector div1. We've defined some basic properties, including background color, width, and height. Note that we have not declared a position property. Let's take a look at this page in our web browser to see what it looks like. We can see that the div is positioned where we might expect, at the top left corner of the content area, because that's where the content of our body would normally begin. Without specifying a position property, the default position is known as the static position. The element will inherit its position based on the normal flow of content on the page. If we wanted to specify the position is static, we could do so by creating this declaration. And when we refresh our web browser, there should be no change in positioning. Relative positioning allows us to add additional properties to a position declaration that specify the top, left, right, and bottom position coordinates of the element. To illustrate an example, let's add the following properties to our style rule. Now, if we were to refresh our web page and take a look at this in our web browser, we'll notice that nothing has changed. Even though we've specified the top and left position, the element is in the exact same place it was prior to adding those declarations. The reason for this is because our position is still set to static. Let's go ahead and change the position to relative and see the difference. We can now see that this element has moved from 50 pixels from the left side of our content area and 50 pixels down from the top of our content area. Now let's work with nested divs. We're going to create a div inside this div and see how the relative positioning is affected when we're working with nested and parent divs. The first thing we need to do is create the ID selector for the nested div. We'll call it div2. And we'll create some properties for this div. We're making it a different color, and we'll also make it a different size, so then that way we can clearly see a distinction between our original div and this new nested div. Okay, we'll keep the position as relative to see how a relative positioned div behaves inside of another div that it also has the same position declaration. So we'll go ahead and insert our nested div in our body. We'll reference ID selector div2. And we'll just save our file. And this is what the new document looks like. We can see that our nested div is situated within our parent, our container div. Now we want to move the nested div 80 pixels from the top and left relative to the parent div. In order to do this, all we need to do is add the top and left declarations to our style rule. Now when we save our file and refresh, we can see that the nested div has moved 80 pixels from the top and 80 pixels from the left relative not to the web browser's content area, but to its parent div. So keep that in mind. Another position property is absolute positioning. Absolute positioning will ensure the element stays in the exact same position specified in the style rule. It does not consider the flow of the page when you resize the browser window. Let's take a look at an example to illustrate this concept. Say we added a block of text above our div tags. I'm just copying a block of text and I'm going to add it above the div tags here. Now I'm going to save the file and we're going to preview this page in the web browser. Take a look at what happens when we scale the browser, when we resize it to bigger and smaller. You'll see that the div is moving up and down to accommodate the text as the browser shrinks and expands. With relative positioning, the div moves with the flow of the page. Now let's change the position of our parent div to absolute. Okay, remember that div1 is our parent, and we'll change the position to absolute. Now when we save the page and refresh it, you'll see that the div remains in the exact same position as specified in our style declaration. This is regardless of what we do. So if we were to resize the browser now, the parent div will stay in the exact same position we specified. Notice that the nested div, div2, is still relative to its parent div. The last element position property we'll discuss is the fixed position. Fixed position is similar to absolute positioning. The difference is that with fixed positioning, the element does not scroll with the page. Let's take a look at an example. To see the difference between absolute and fixed positioning, we need to insert a much larger block of text above our div tags. This will force the page to allow scrolling. So I'm going to copy a large block of text and I'm going to paste it. So you can see that it's a lot longer than the previous block of text. So if I save the page and I preview it in the web browser, we can see that the page now scrolls. Okay, so we went over absolute positioning. Okay, our parent in the last exercise had absolute positioning, and we can see that with absolute positioning, the parent div does in fact move with the rest of the content when you scroll up and down. Now let's change the position to fixed. And when we save the file, refresh our browser, you can see now that the parent div does not move up and down as you scroll through the contents of the web page. And that is the difference there between fixed and absolute positioning. The float property is used to wrap images around HTML elements, such as images, as shown in this example. In this tutorial, we'll create this effect. First, we need to set up our basic HTML page structure. Once complete, save the file as float.html. Now we need to enter a block of text in our body. Make sure that the block of text is long enough so that there is enough text to wrap around the image you're inserting. I've copied a large block of text and I'm pasting it within the body tags. Next, we'll insert the image that will be used for this tutorial. You can use your own image, or you can use the one provided in the Downloads folder corresponding to this lesson. Now we need to create the float effect by creating a style sheet and inserting the following style declaration. Now to create the float effect, float right means the image will appear on the right of the text. We could also use the float left declaration if that was our intention. In that case, the image would appear on the left side of the text. We've also added a margin so there is space on the left and bottom side of the image. Let's save our file and preview it in our web browser. And as you can see, the text is now wrapped around the image with a text 10 pixel margin on the left side and on the bottom of the image as well. The clear property is used to control the behavior of floating elements. Elements that are positioned after a floating element will flow around it. This HTML page shows an example of this. The page contains 3 divs. One is blue, the other is red, and one is yellow. The blue div has a float left property attached to it. For this reason, the text contained in the red div floats to the right side of the blue div. We can see the text wrap around the blue div. In order to prevent the yellow div from floating to the right as well, we've put a clear declaration. This forces the div below the blue div, unlike the red div, which does not have a clear declaration. The z-index property allows us to specify the stack order of an element. To better illustrate this, let's take a look at an example. On this HTML page, we've defined the style for 2 divs, div blue and div yellow. The blue div has a width of 600 pixels, a height of 50 pixels, background color of blue. Its position from the top is 0 pixels, and a position property set to absolute. The yellow div is almost identical, except the width is 400 pixels, height is 400 pixels, and the background color is yellow. Since they both have the exact same top position, these 2 divs are stacked on top of one another. So let's take a look at this in our web browser to see what it looks like. We can see that by default, the yellow div is on top of the blue div. But what if we wanted the yellow div underneath the blue div? In this case, we need to specify the z-index property for each div. Let's give the yellow div a z-index of 1, and the blue div a z-index of 2. I've saved the page and I'm going to refresh, and we can now see that the blue div is on top of the yellow div because it has a higher z-index. In this lesson, we'll be styling links using CSS. A link can have 4 different states: unvisited, visited, hover, and active. An unvisited link means the user has not yet clicked on the link. A visited link means the user has clicked on the link. The hover state is when the user's mouse is hovering over the link. The active state is the exact moment that the link is clicked. Knowing this is important because we need to define a style rule for each state. On our HTML page here on the left, we can see an example of how this is done. To identify a link, we start with the A property followed by a colon. Next, we specify the state. We've started with just the default state, link. We've set the color to red with no text decoration, and we can see that in our web browser. The color is red and there's no underline or any other form of text decoration. The hover link has a color rule set to purple, as well as a text decoration set to underline and background color set to yellow. So let's see the effect that produces. You can see the background is yellow. The text changes from red to purple and it is now underlined. When the link is clicked, we can see that the selected link property activates. So when we click it, the purple or the red changes to blue. Lastly, we have a visited link property with color set to blue. That means if somebody were to visit the link that this link points to, then the red would automatically default to blue because it would now be considered a visited link. We can greatly improve the look, styling, and responsiveness of an HTML table by using CSS tables. Here, we have an example of a CSS table with some basic formatting. On the left, let's take a look at the way the code is structured for this table. I'm going to scroll down to the body tags and we'll take a look at the style sheet in a moment. Inside our body tag, we have our open and close table tags. Inside the table tags, we also have the TR tags that represent the table rows, the TH tags for the table headings, and the TD tags for the table columns. We're already familiar with table row and table columns, but table headings may be new to you. The TH tag represents the table heading, and it makes styling the headings of your table much more convenient. Let's take a look at our style sheet now. Here we have 4 style definitions. The first will apply a 1-pixel border to the table column, and the table headings. The text alignment is also set to left. So a border and text alignment. Next, we've set a border collapse property to the table style rule. This collapses the table borders into a single border. It just makes it look a lot neater. I'll take this out just to show you what it looks like without it. So you can see that we now have the double border look going on. I'll add that back in. The next rule adds 15 pixel padding around our table headers and table columns. So you can see there's a fair bit of spacing around the text inside each cell. Lastly, we've added a hover effect to our table rows using the TR hover rule. As we hover our mouse over the rows, the background changes to cyan. And so as you can see, there's a lot more you can do with CSS tables versus regular HTML tables. Now that we're familiar with CSS, we'll work on creating a CSS-based web page using a commonly used 3-column responsive layout. This is what the final result will look like. We'll have a navigation menu at the top with 4 links. Each link has a mouse over effect, and one of the links is active by default. The navigation bar is also nested inside a header div, and that's the black background area that you see behind the navigation. Next, we have our 3 columns, which will hold the content of our page. We've placed text content in this example to keep it simple and easy to follow. The 3 columns are designed to collapse below one another depending on the user's screen size. As you can see, when we shrink the screen, the header is on top. The center content area is second, followed by the blue and yellow content areas. At the very bottom, we have our footer as well. This makes the web page fully compatible with any mobile device and any screen size. So with that out of the way, we'll go ahead and get started. The first step in this project is to create our basic HTML page structure as shown here. Once you've done that, save the file on your computer. You can name the file whatever you like. Next, we'll create a style sheet for our CSS rules. So inside your head tag, create your open and close style tags. We'll start with creating our first rule. This will be for the body property. Create a margin definition set to 0, padding set to 0, and a line height set to 1.5 em. This will ensure there is no spacing around the perimeter of our page content. It also sets the default line spacing for the text on our page. Next, we'll create a set of definitions for our header. So this is for the header div. Start with a background definition set to black. We'll set the font family to Arial and a height of 100 pixels. And so that is for this piece over here, the black background underneath the navigation. Now we'll need to create a style rule for the div that will contain our 3 columns. So column 1, 2, and 3. We'll name this rule content wrapper. Since we need the footer to attach itself beneath the content wrapper, we need to set a float left property on the wrapper. So that's what we've done here. We've also given the wrapper a width of 100%. This is because we're creating a fluid layout which scales and shrinks to the full width of the browser's content area. So as I expand the browser, you'll notice that the layout expands with it and contracts with it, so it's fluid. Inside the content wrapper, we need to create a style rule that will contain each individual column. For this rule, we'll create one definition, and that definition will be margin. Set the margin to 0, 230 px, 0, and 230 pixels again, and call it content column. This means that the left column and the right column will be a fixed 230 pixels at all times. The center content area will be fluid. So as I expand the browser, you'll notice that the middle content area expands and contracts, where the left and right column stay at a fixed 230 pixels. Now we can set the rules for our left and right columns. We'll start with the left. So create the following style rule. We'll call it left column. That's what we'll name our div. For this, create a float definition and set it to left. Also set the width to 230 pixels. Set a margin left definition to negative 100%. This will help ensure that the columns remain positioned correctly. And for the background color, set it to this value, or you can set it to another background color if you like as well. Now for the right column, again, set the float to left, width to 230 pixels. This time set the margin left definition to negative 230 pixels. Again, this is for the purpose of making sure that the columns stay in the right position, regardless of the browser's size. And we've set the background color to this value, which is this yellowish background, but you can use whatever color you like. Next, we need to create a rule for the div that will hold our text content. So we'll call it inner text, and it's a class, and it'll be applied to any div that contains text content. So for example, here, here, and here. You can see that around the text we have a margin, and that's a 20 pixel margin. The font family is Arial, and the color of the text is a light gray color, and this is the hex code for the color. Now we'll create a rule for the footer, and that's this black bar right at the bottom. First, we'll create the clear rule and set it to left, and this will ensure that the footer stays in the correct position at the bottom of the content wrapper. Set the width to 100%, background is black, the text color is white, font is Arial, text alignment inside the div is center, and there's a bit of a padding, 4 pixel padding around the text. With our main styles created, we can now go ahead and create the styles for our navigation menu. The navigation links will be contained within an unordered list, and for this reason, we'll start by creating a rule for our UL elements. I'll just create a comment to separate our main styles from the navigation bar. And this is our first style here. So for the UL elements, we've set the list style type to none, and this will make sure that there's no bullets or numbering next to each item in the list. The margin padding is set to 0, and the background color is set to black. Next, we'll create a list rule and give it a float definition of left. This will make sure that all the links appear in one row next to one another. Also set a border right definition and set the values to 1 pixel solid and this hex code for the color. We'll need to create a rule for the last element in the list, which is the contact link. And what we want to do is we don't want a border at the end of this one. So set the last child attribute of the list property, give it a border right none definition. Now we'll create a definition for the link elements in the list. So for any A attribute contained within a list element, we've set the display to block, color to white, text alignment to center. We've added a bit of padding around the text and no text decoration. We'll need to create a rule for the mouse over effect that you see here. And so this is how it's done. Just create a background color definition and set it to this hex code. And that's what's going to give this effect here. Lastly, we'll create a rule to set the background color of the first link to blue. So this will be an active link. Just indicates to the user what page they're on. And so it's an active class with the background color set to this hex code. Now we'll create the style rules to make our layout responsive on mobile devices. We'll start with devices that have a maximum screen size of 840 pixels. For these, we'll drop the right column under the other two columns. Let's take a look at an example. So when the screen size falls below 840 pixels, you'll notice that the right column falls underneath the other two. So that's the first rule we want to set up. So I'll start with a comment just to separate it from the navigation styles. We'll need to start with a media property and set the max width to 840 pixels. Now we'll create a rule for the left column and set the margin left definition to negative 100%. Now we'll create a rule for the right column, set float to none, width to 100%, margin left to 0, and clear to both. Create a rule for the content column, just set the margin right to 0. And then just close our open media style. Now we'll create a set of rules for devices with a max screen size of 600 pixels. So at below 600 pixels, we want both the left and the right column to be positioned underneath the main center content area. So that makes it fully responsive on all devices. So we have two rules, one for the left column and one for the content column. So you can go ahead and enter those. And once you've finished that, we've completed our entire style sheet. And in the next lesson, we'll start building the page in our body tags. Now that we have our style rules created, we can go ahead and create our divs inside the body tags. First, we will create a container that will contain all the elements of our page. Inside the container, we'll insert the header. And remember that the header contains our navigation. And the navigation elements are structured within an unordered list. So that's what that will look like. Next, we'll insert our content wrapper. And the content wrapper again will contain all our three columns. And then insert the content column div. This is the center content area. And we created the inner text rule that adds the padding or the margin around our text. So we'll go ahead and insert the inner text div. And inside this div, we'll insert some text. The next div we want to insert is the left column. And so just create this code block. So we have the div for the left column, and then inside the left column, again, we're using the inner text div to add margin and some font styling to our text. And this is just some random text that we've entered. And we'll do the same for the right column. And the last thing we'll enter is our footer. And that's the entire page completed. So go ahead and preview it in your browser. And this is the end result. So that's a responsive CSS layout.